We editors and journalists, we are very good at talking. We are not so good at listening. And now we just heard from news consumers from around the world, and listening to what they have to say can do something for us. I remember when I had my job at the DR as executive news director at the Danish Public Broadcasting, the version of BBC in my little country, 1/10 the size, 100% of its problems. I was sitting there thinking that we had to work with constructive journalism, but it was bigger than DR. So my idea was we wanted to build an organization around it, NGO, working with constructive journalism around the world. And I was thinking that I should be the chairman of that, and I would hire someone to do all the work, and I would continue having my great job running a newsroom of 500 people. But then I got an email from a news consumer. She told me in an email, which I opened when I was sitting in the newsroom a late evening. She was sending this email from her little mid-English town in Great Britain. And she sent me a link to a YouTube video, which she thought that I would care about, because she told me she was frustrated with news. And I was even one of the persons who were responsible for that kind of news. And she also had read somewhere that I somewhat shared her frustration. So I watched that video. And after that, when I cleared my eyes, I made a decision. Let's see it. And I will show that for you now.
The purpose of the news is to engage and inform, empower people to bring about reform, but their words are being lost by the noise of the storm. We hear about disaster, murder, conflict, and violence, and after a while this becomes white noise like silence. Because when there's a bias for the negative, we lose becoming sensitive, and instead we become emotionally dead. You see, this negativity has been shown to be destructively informing me, dividing me from society by creating this fear and anxiety. For many, they watch helplessly as if we're damned to be. But that's not the only story of the fate of our humanity. Let's hear about progress, acknowledge solutions. This excess of negativity, it's like mental pollution. When we do see good news, it's misrepresented. We hear cats being saved from trees and the conversation is ended, saved instead for an "and finally." But finally, these stories of possibility are being shown to be a vital story for society. We need to learn about how problems are being solved, issues resolved, for the sake of our souls. Not for ignorant bliss, but because we are better than this. We don't need sugarcoating or positive spins. Again, that's a cynical view that this conversation underpins. And don't get it confused with entertainment, PR, or fluff. Enough is enough. It's rigorous journalism reporting on progress, reporting on problems, but not ignoring success. We publicize failure, corruption, and shame, but when it comes to human potential, it's not treated the same, and the hypocrisy is killing me. Are you kidding me? They point the finger at every other industry, but leave them be. As this excess of negativity increases in velocity, atrocity, chasing more controversy. But where is the nobility in preying on morbid curiosity? I feel cheated, defeated by newspapers' allegiance to profits and clickbaits, regardless of if it generates hate and drums up the nation into a fearful state. Some people find it too much to take, and then the stories become lost because people switch off. But if we want a nation that's engaged and informed, it's time to reform. Make a new norm, empower, inspire, help us achieve higher. Report the good in other people, not just replay their evil. If we witness the unbelievable, it makes it more achievable. A solution seems more feasible. The only option now is to freeze or fall. After all, the truth of the world includes the good and the bad, the happy and the sad. So why would you just tell one half of the story? It leaves us in mourning, unable to see that the new day is dawning. The power lies in us becoming aware, to ensure they take more care about the stories they tell when they look at the world out there. And why should we care? Because the truth is, the news is an organisation that's intrusive of our minds, and it's a matter of time before their words become our thoughts, shaping our opinions more and more. So what we're asking for, as I've said before, is rigorous journalism reporting on progress, reporting on problems but not ignoring success. It may sound idealistic, it's been labelled naive, but let me assure you this is not an ignorant plea. The research says it's obvious, and to ignore it is preposterous. So it's time for the consumers to take a stand, because the industry will listen to us.
When I had when I closed this video, I it really hit me, and I made a decision. I realized that if I really thought this was important, if this woman was right, being a news consumer, and I was trying to go to work every day to do good for society, and she was just a little right in what she was doing, this was so much bigger than DR and my job. And I thought I had to commit myself to that. So in that moment, I decided to quit my job and dedicate myself to this. And I'm so proud to, with us at this conference, have Jodie Jackson, who was the woman behind this video. And she's talking to us from her house in South London. And Jodie, welcome. And thank you for producing that video. What's the story behind it? Why did you do it?
Well, I did it because I realized, similar to yourself, that this is something that was bigger than just me. You know, I had gotten to the point personally where I couldn't watch the news anymore. And it wasn't any particular thing that happened. It was a gradual progression that moved me from being someone who watched it daily to someone who could no longer stand it. And when I very briefly stopped watching the news, there was a lot of judgment. People were quite harsh in their response to my decision. And there's this huge social pressure to be informed through the news. And the reaction that other people had towards me, that I was shallow or weak or ignorant, made me feel that I was damaged in some way. You know, that there was something in me that wasn't strong enough or brave enough to see the world in its terrible existence. And when I'm naturally quite a curious person. And so when I started to investigate my experience further, I realized that this was something very collective. A lot of people felt the same way as me. And that's when I realized I sort of started investigating it, researching it. I went back to university to do a master's to understand the psychological impact of the news on our mental health. And that's when I realized that it wasn't me that was broken or damaged. It was the industry that was broken or damaged. And that's when I wanted to be able to share my learnings with everyone. And a thesis or a master's sort of dissertation isn't quite an interesting read. So I put it in the format of a poem and decided to share it with other people and connect with others around this idea.
So to be clear, you are not a trained journalist. You are not. You were a news consumer. What was actually your job in the beginning of all this?
Well, it still is. So I work in perfumery. I work in a family business, and we've been creating. I say we've been creating fragrances since 1975. That's when the company started. I've been there for the last 10 years.
So you are basically seeing the news industry from the outside. With the reactions you are getting from this from around the world, what would you how do you would describe the situation for the news industry?
For the industry itself, or for the consumer?
For the industry, because how do consumers see the professional journalism industry? What's the characterization of it?
Well, I mean, the biggest, when you sort of look into audience engagement, or more commonly disengagement with the news at the moment, the biggest reason is because people find it too depressing. It's not that people aren't interested. And so there is this real intuitive sense that there is something wrong, and it's not necessarily connecting with people. And it's not a short-term problem. You know, it's not one news story about one problem that causes this kind of feeling of, you know, depression about the state of the world or disappointment in humanity. It's when you have this continuous and excessive reporting on problems over a long period of time without a balanced understanding of what's being done about it. And when I've shared my insights with industry, as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of resistance to change and to even talk seriously about constructive journalism or solutions news, because it's not the status quo. And so where I found myself, and although that's changing dramatically in the last 10 years because of people like yourself and organizations like Constructive Institute, I have found, for me, it's much easier to go to the consumer because I have authenticity. I am a consumer. I share their frustrations. I've created a different media diet for myself that allows me to be informed and empowered. And there doesn't have to be this kind of collateral damage of mental health issues by being informed about the state of the world. And so I've kind of created all of my research really for them to be able to share with them ways to understand how the news is produced, but what we can then do about it, so that we're not impacted as much by their kind of if it bleeds it leads focus.
But what do you say when you hear the argument, which is a right one? I mean, we are not in the happy business in news. We are not there to put a smile on people's faces. We also have to tell people about places in the world where it's terrible, in order, because if we don't tell it, they won't know it. That kind of argument is true also, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's a hugely important one. You know, I've grown from actually doing this, from being disengaged. I've created a wealth of respect for the industry and the kind of bravery that it takes to tell those kind of stories, and the necessity that society requires of them. You know, unless we're made aware of a problem, we're not in a position to be able to confront and correct it. So it is a good thing. But just because something's good, it doesn't mean its benefits are endless. And when we have too much of it, it moves from being helpful to becoming harmful. And that's where we are now. And a lot of advice around mental health issues when it comes to this barrage of negativity is to tune out. That's what a lot of mental health professionals will advise you, is to stop watching it, take a break, you know.
News avoidance is a
Yeah,
big thing,
and
right?
the problem with that is it's so incomplete, because when you actually include solutions into your media diet, you're not becoming ignorant of problems. You know, solutions don't exist in some altruistic isolation to everything else that goes on. They're very much connected to the problem. And I'm sure that this has been covered by someone at some point in the conference, but it's with journalism, you've got the who, what, where, when, why. And constructive journalism says, well, what next? It just recognizes that, yes, there is a problem, but the problem isn't always the end of the story. So we look beyond it to see what's being done about it, and not to celebrate it, but to investigate it and to understand the processes that are taking place, to see if we're able to learn anything from that information. And there's usually really valuable stuff there. And we're being kind of starved of it. We're not being told about it because it doesn't fall into the traditional news format.
And you have actually taken this one step further, and you have done research. You're taking a master degree later on, and you've been writing a book, actually a very great book. It's called "You Are What You Read," which is basically a statement from the news consumer. And if you should put it short, what does it do to news consumers if you are giving this news diet day after day after day?
So if you're consuming the negativity in the news continuously, well, it can lead to a whole host of issues, mainly because we're fundamentally developing an inaccurate understanding of the world, because we have this distorted picture where the problems are very much magnified and enlarged, and the solutions are very much minimized and ignored. So it leaves us with the impression that the world's in a state of decline. And that there's also very little we can do about it because we don't see progress taking place. So this can make us feel anxious, pessimistic, and depressed. And these feelings actually linger even after we switch off our news program, because we become so well rehearsed at feeling them. And we can also develop a feeling of helplessness. These problems they seem too big to solve, and that can lead to a reduction in our helpful behavior. But another reason why we might kind of disengage and not be so helpful is because it increases feelings of contempt and hostility towards other people, because you're constantly witnessing humanity at its worst. It gives you very little faith in them, really, and in being sort of part of a more constructive element of them. And we can also develop fear, and that's a very self-protective emotion. So again, we become less collectively helpful because we're sort of just looking out for ourselves. And one of the kind of more sad effects of it is that we just become desensitized. So when we do hear these shocking stories that should rightly grab our attention and force us into action, we we sort of just stop caring, because not only do we come to accept that the world is just riddled with problems, but we actually come to expect it. You know, when we go to tune into the news, that's exactly what we expect to hear. And so it softens our shock shield. You know, we're not as stunned or as responsive as we could be otherwise. And then finally, as I said before, people disengage. They just switch off from the news to try and avoid these feelings. And that's where I had gotten to. But it was through solutions journalism and constructive journalism that I found my way back into the news and really respected its value. But it has to be consumed in a different way, you know, in a way that re-empowers me rather than disempowers me.
Jodie, have you started following news again, and has it improved? Can you see any progress in the way the news business is trying to be more responsible and do what you are talking about?
In some cases, I mean, yes, it has definitely brought me back into the news, and I'm now a regular news consumer again, but my habits have changed. So I don't tune in necessarily daily. I subscribe to a much slower form of journalism that is either weekly or quarterly, mainly because the world doesn't move that quickly. And even if it does, we still need time to make sense of its events. So I much prefer a slower form of journalism, which also allows a wider time frame on an issue. So you kind of have space for that what next question where you might not otherwise. And I also actively and deliberately include solutions into my media diet, because if I'm not conscious about it, I won't see them. So I also make a conscious choice to subscribe to news organizations that practice this kind of journalism. And what's been amazing is, yeah, it's changed. You know, there's more organizations around doing very credible forms of solutions journalism or constructive journalism. And it's showing that, A, there's a huge demand for it, especially in the younger generation. But it's creating a really viable business model for the industry, because not only are you showing that there's an audience, you're actually showing that you can better monetize them and they're more engaged. So it's kind of a win-win for both the industry and the consumer. So it is changing, and there is more choice, and we can be more deliberate. So it's a good time, I think, to be a news consumer, provided you do it in a deliberate way.
You are a mother of two, 2.5 almost. You are expecting your third baby. And you have been writing a book. It's just coming out now. I think it's the first children's book on constructive journalism. Little Raffle and the World Beyond. Why did you write that one?
Well, I have a 3-year-old, and when coronavirus sort of really blew up globally and through the national news narrative, I found the way that it was reported so terrible. You know, the kind of littering death statistics continuously, and the way in which it was covered. And don't get me wrong, I completely understand there was a crisis and there was a problem, but we weren't looking to history for how it had been, you know, how problems like this had been solved before. We weren't necessarily looking at best practice to see what countries were doing it well. And that's a really valuable story, because it does help hold power to account when you see progress taking place somewhere else. You know, it puts pressure to be able to do something similar if it is replicable. But I found it so difficult to think about how I would talk to my daughter about this and how I could protect her from all of this information coming from so many different ways. And I realized I couldn't. You know, that information is there and I can't stop her from seeing it, but I can help her develop tools to be able to navigate it successfully, so that she stays informed, but she doesn't become overwhelmed and terrified. And this is something that I had been speaking to adults about for years now. And it was something that I fully investigated. I began looking into when I was about 22, 23. And I just thought, wow, you know, we don't need to wait that long before we start changing our habits. Children need to understand this from a very early age and develop the kind of coping mechanisms and skills that it takes to actually move through this information in a very helpful, informative, and empowering way, so that they grow up feeling able to confront these world's problems, not hide away from them.
Jodie, now you have the eyes and ears of a lot of publishers, editors, journalists, and not at least future journalists around the world. What would your single advice be to all of us in the news industry, who work on deadlines all the time, fierce pressure, budget cuts, um, going to work every day, and basically wants to do good, but there's a culture out there. What would your advice be to us?
There's a really good quote from he calls himself a purposologist. I think his name is Michael Den Heijer. And he says, when a flower doesn't blossom, you change the environment that it grows in. You don't change the flower. So I don't think there's anything that I could say to any one individual person about the way in which they do their job that's going to make for a better industry. I would say change the industry. Do something bigger than your deadline. Do something bigger than this story. Change the culture, and the rest will follow. And I think that we'll all be much healthier and abundant for it.
Jodie, thank you for dedicating a lot of your time into this as the voice of the frustrated and hopeful news consumer. I hope you will have a beautiful baby. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.